Social collapse is just social change that hurts. How societies outlive the stories they once told about who we are. Written and read by yours truly, Oakie McDoakie. Screw ups and all. It isn't worth it. Those words escaped my wife's lips as a whisper. She was sitting up in bed. I was lying next to her. We had just come home from our second couples counseling session, still raw, still trying to believe that trying meant something. When I heard her speak, I sat bolt upright and asked, "What?" She looked confused, alarmed. She said she hadn't said anything at all, but she had. She knew it, and I knew it. That was the moment I understood, not intellectually, but in my body, that our marriage was already over. Not finished, not untangled, not formally dissolved, but done in the only way that matters. Somewhere, quietly and without ceremony, one of us had decided that whatever this thing was costing, it wasn't worth it anymore. What followed took months and years. The slow, grinding work of separation, the division of money and objects, furniture, photos, books, kitchen junk that somehow mattered, the reshuffling of friendships and extended family, the redefinition of myself as a person who was no longer part of that we. It hurt bitterly. Being left always does, and yet with time I could see that I had been the leaver in other relationships, romantic and otherwise. Since then, I've played both roles and likely will again. You could say the marriage failed, that this small society, a household, a family, collapsed. But collapse makes it sound sudden, catastrophic, as if there were a single moment when everything fell apart. What actually happened was slower and more painful. The marriage didn't suddenly shatter so much as become unsustainable. The emotional, psychological, and practical costs kept rising. The returns kept shrinking. Until one day, perhaps many days, someone finally thought, this isn't worth it. When historians talk about societies collapsing, they usually mean that a particular political and economic arrangement stopped working, not that the people themselves disappeared. Just as important, they mean that a society's shared story about itself, who we are, how power works, who does what, and what makes life worth sustaining, stopped making sense. That, it turns out, is how most versions of societies end. When historians and archaeologists argue about why civilizations collapse, they often sound uncannily like divorcing couples. One side emphasizes environmental stress, another points to institutional rigidity, another blames elite insulation, inequality, or bad incentives. Each explanation contains truth. None is sufficient, and none provides the kind of clean answer that would make the loss easier to bear. Anyone who's been through a divorce will recognize this immediately. Take the classic Maya. For generations, their so-called collapse has been treated as one of history's great cautionary tales. Around the 8th and 9th centuries, the great city-states of the southern lowlands stopped building monuments. Kings vanished from inscriptions. Palaces were abandoned. Maya long count dates, one of the clearest markers of centralized political life, fell silent. It looks dramatic in retrospect, but the evidence tells a quieter, sadder story. There is no sign of mass death, no layers of bodies from plague or conquest, no archaeological horizon that screams catastrophe. There was drought, yes, serious and recurring drought. There was strain on food systems. Over time, the population declined perhaps to a quarter of its peak. But this did not happen all at once. It took a couple of centuries, like the slow work of compound interest, only in reverse. More than half simply left the lowland home of their ancestors. Families migrated upland toward more reliable rainfall. Others stayed and adapted. Birth rates fell slightly. Child mortality likely rose a bit. Nothing dramatic enough to notice year to year. Only enough over generations to change everything. At some point, never announced, never recorded, enough people must have concluded that life under the old system was no longer worth it. Not worth the labor demanded by divine kings. Not worth maintaining cities that no longer paid back what they required. Not worth clinging to a story about divine kingship and monumental cities that no longer matched lived reality. The Maya did not disappear. They simply reached a point where the old way of holding society was no longer worth sustaining. And here is the part that rarely makes it into popular accounts. The Maya are still here. Not as a revived culture, not as a living history museum, as real people, millions of them, speaking dozens of Maya languages across southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, farming, raising families, fixing cars, running shops, practicing syncretic religions, arguing about politics, studying in universities, making modern lives under difficult conditions. In some regions, they even govern themselves. If you have heard of the Zapatista autonomous communities in southern Mexico, you have already encountered this reality. These communities, largely indigenous, many of them Maya, operate semi autonomously, running their own schools, clinics, and local councils outside the formal structure of the Mexican state. Whatever one thinks of their politics, they are not remnants of a collapsed civilization. They are evidence of continuity, adaptation, and refusal. It is entirely possible, likely even, that you have met Maya people in your own life without realizing it. In the United States, Canada, and beyond, migrants from Guatemala and southern Mexico, Honduras, and Belize live and work alongside you. You may have stood next to them in a grocery store, worked with them on a job site, or heard a Maya language spoken nearby and assumed it was Spanish or something else entirely. That quiet invisibility is part of the myth of collapse. When Americans are taught that the Maya collapsed, what they usually mean is that they stopped building stone cities that impressed archaeologists. What actually happened is that their ancestors chose lives that were more survivable, more flexible, and, under changed conditions, more worth sustaining. Scholars argue about the causes: climate stress, political rigidity, diminishing returns on complexity, elite overproduction. But those arguments are, in a sense, debates about why a shared story stopped working. They disagree over mechanisms the way former partners disagree about what went wrong. Beneath these disagreements lies a shared intuition. Systems end when enough people decide, implicitly or explicitly, that they are not worth sustaining. That is the part of collapse that we rarely talk about, because it is morally uncomfortable. It suggests choice without clarity, agency without certainty. It suggests people do not always leave because they have a better plan, but because staying hurts more than leaving. And that ambiguity, that murkiness, is itself a source of pain. About the end of our marriage, my ex and I tell different stories. Neither is a lie. Neither is the whole truth. I tell different stories now than I did 5 years ago. My understanding keeps changing. The reasons for failure were as complex as the marriage itself, mixed up with our histories, our wounds, our expectations, our blind spots. There is no final accounting. There never will be. And that hurts. Civilizations don't get clean explanations either. The ancient Maya did not leave us a manifesto explaining why divine kingship stopped working. Rome did not issue a formal notice of decline. People living through these transitions rarely know why the old story is failing, only that continuing to believe it is costing them more than they can afford. That is where we are now. To be an American today is not the same thing it was in 1926 or 1826. The institutions overlap. The flag remains, the words are familiar, but the story has changed. Who counts as us? What the state owes its people, what people owe each other, what sacrifices are worth making, and which ones no longer are. Some believe the United States is sliding toward autocracy. Others believe this is another brutal but temporary phase, something like the Gilded Age that will eventually force a new social contract. A few think things are better than ever. There is no agreement. There may never be. History suggests this is normal, even if it doesn't feel reassuring. What many people feel, though, is not just institutional strain, but narrative strain. The sense that the old story no longer explains their lives, yet no new story has fully taken its place. The costs are rising. The returns are shrinking. The story no longer reconciles with experience. Is this collapse? Or is this just change? History's unsatisfying answer is that it's usually both, and neither. What is ending is not a people, but an arrangement. Not a civilization, but a story about how it must be organized. My marriage did not end the night I heard that whisper, but that was the moment when the old story stopped being worth the effort required to keep telling it. The unraveling took a long time, and when it was done, I was still here, changed, scarred, still standing, and still moving on. Neither were the Maya erased. Neither will we be. Change is inevitable. Grief is unavoidable. And collapse, real collapse, is almost never a sudden fall. It is the long, painful realization that the old way of holding things together no longer justifies the cost. It is the moment, whispered or unspoken, when enough people decide it isn't worth it anymore. If you like this, you can tip me on ko-fi.com/Oakie McDoakie or follow me on Substack and the socials. Just go to oakiemcdoakie.com. Until next time, don't let the bastards wear you down.